Terrific. Harrison is an American hero, as all astronauts are. Our next speaker hails from Canada, which is north of Wisconsin. And he is also a hero, though a hero of a slightly different type. Stephen McIntyre is the host of Climate Audit, which is a blog. I guess some of you have heard of Climate Audit. It's devoted to the analysis and discussion of climate data. He has worked for 30 years in the hard rock mineral exploration industry as an officer or director of several public mining exploration companies. He has served as a policy analyst for the Canadian government and for Ontario. He's best known for his investigation of the validity of the hockey stick graph used very famously in a journal article by Michael Mann. That's right, wave your sticks if you've got them. This article, the hockey stick, of course, then appeared in IPCC reports, including the most recent IPCC reports. Steve's repeated requests for data from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia led to the incident that has come to be called Climategate. Steve represents several things, I think, that are best about science: independence, skepticism, and persistence. The fact that he is not an academic has infuriated his critics and delights us. I think when future historians write the story about the great global warming delusion and how it ended, I think Steve McIntyre is going to have a very prominent place in that book. We are very lucky to have Steve with us tonight to give us an update on what's going on with the Climategate controversy. Please welcome Steve McIntyre.
Well, thank you for the warm reception. This is by far the largest audience that I've ever spoke to, so and I don't come from, as Joe said, I don't come from a small town in the United States. I actually come from a large city in Canada. And Toronto, I think, is probably south of the small town that Joe comes from. As all of you realize, I have a pretty unique perspective on Climategate. And while many important issues are, just a moment. While many important issues are raised by the emails, what I'm going to do today is follow the most notorious email, the trick to hide the decline, and try to put that in context, right from its origin in the 1998 reconstructions of Briffa and Mann through the third assessment report, and on to the Jones's equally notorious request to delete all emails, then on to Climategate and the half-hearted inquiries. A few caveats. The trick itself, the obstruction of FOI requests, the whitewash inquiries, and the seemingly obtuse reaction of the climate science community inevitably places this community in a bad light for audiences like this. Nonetheless, keep in mind that nothing that I say tonight proves or disproves global warming, nor does climate science as a whole stand or fall on proxy reconstructions. If we knew nothing about tree rings, we would still be obliged to assess the impact of doubled CO2. As a final preamble, there's far too much angriness, in my opinion, on both sides of the debate. People are far too quick to yell fraud at the other side, and I think such language is both self-indulgent and counterproductive. I don't apply these labels myself. I don't permit them at Climate Audit, and don't believe they serve any purpose. That doesn't mean you can't criticize authors. I do so all the time and will do so tonight. But any point you make should be able to be done on the facts rather than adjectives. The trick email had its roots in the 1998 Mann and Briffa temperature reconstructions. Both were submitted independently in 1997, actually within a few days of one another. Both drew on very large tree ring networks, but their later 20th century results were diametrically opposite. Mann's went sharply up while Briffa's went down. You see the down part of the Briffa reconstruction in the graphic above. Disguising this inconsistency between the two reconstructions rather than explaining it has led to much of the strange history in this field. The Briffa reconstruction was based on densities from a very large network collected in the early 1990s by Fritz Schweingruber from 400 sites in northern Canada, Siberia, classed as temperature dependent. To this day, it remains by far the largest sample of this type. In these early articles of Briffas, the decline was not hidden. For most analysts looking at a graph like this, the unavoidable question would be, if tree rings don't respond to late 20th century warming, how would we know that they didn't do the same thing in response to possible earlier warmth? A question that remains unanswered to this day. The famous Mann reconstruction was published in April '98, a month before Mann received his PhD. Mann also used a tree ring network of over 400 sites, but instead of only using temperature-limited ones, Mann included precipitation-limited sites from the U.S. Southwest, and notably Graybill's bristlecone pines, which climate audit readers know about, which had a pronounced 20th century growth pulse, which the author said was not due to temperature. And instead of using averages like Briffa, Mann used principal components, or his own adaptation of the method, that enhanced the contribution of bristlecone pines. What I show here is the first version of the Mann reconstruction, which is rather muddy and gives little hint of its later iconic status. Contact between Jones and Mann commenced around this time. The first Climategate letters between them are polite about the merits of paleoclimate proxies and how to attract attention to the field. The fortunes of Mann and Briffa in September '98 were very different. Despite his then very junior status, a few months from his PhD, Mann was appointed as one of only 8 lead authors of the important Chapter 2 of the third assessment report. On the other hand, Briffa, despite many years of experience, worried about looming unemployment at the start of the new year. A few months after his IPCC appointment, Mann submitted an extension of his reconstruction back to 1,000, including the first recognizable version of the famous hockey stick. It was published in February 1999. Fortuitous timing, since 1998, with its huge El Nino, had been exceptionally warm. Mann wasted no time in incorporating '98 temperatures into his graphic and introduced the now familiar phrases that 1990s were the warmest decade of the millennium, with 1998 the warmest year so far. Co-author Hughes proclaimed the long-sought demise of the medieval warm period. The findings caused a sensation both in the scientific and popular press. Mann's newfound prominence enabled him to escape the precarious life of a postdoc, receiving a faculty position at the University of Virginia a couple of months later. In May '99, Briffa published the first assessment of Mann's results, containing what, to my knowledge, is the first spaghetti graph of reconstructions. In this graphic, there is a new Briffa version, the one in pale blue, which now, instead of going down at the end, coheres rather closely to the Mann reconstruction. In this graphic, for the first time, values after 1960 were deleted. In retrospect, this article represented the first bite of the poison apple of Hide the Decline. It seems to originate in an effort to minimize the discrepancy between the Mann and Briffa reconstruction. Since Briffa, like Mann, believed that the 20th century had been anomalously warm. Briffa's assessment included a few sensible caveats about reconstruction, including the possible dependence of the manned reconstruction on trees in the dry southwest U.S., an issue that McIntyre and I later analyzed in greater detail. Prior to publication, Briffa had sent a copy of his short article to Mann for comment. Mann is now an entirely different figure from the year before, making peremptory demands that Briffa would withdraw even slight criticism. Presaging later conduct, Mann sent a demand to the editor of Science, saying that it was better that nothing appear than something unacceptable to us. Mann's supervisor, Raymond Bradley, immediately dissociated himself from these demands, which he described as amazingly arrogant. Mann then tried to paper over the dispute with a non-apology to Jones and Briffa. Bradley's private comment, "Excuse me while I puke." Meanwhile, Mann's section of the draft third assessment report included a new spaghetti graph giving pride of place to his own reconstruction. It had yet another Briffa version, the one with relatively little variation, shown it in orange on the right-hand version of this graphic to show it, but it had the characteristic late 20th century decline and an unexceptional closing value. This spaghetti graph seems not to have been well received by senior IPCC figures at the lead authors meeting in Tanzania in September '99. In a post-mortem a few weeks later, coordinating lead author Folan wrote that although a proxy diagram was a clear favorite for the policymaker summary, the Briffa reconstruction, quote, dilutes the message rather significantly, adding that this was probably the most important issue to resolve in Chapter 2 at present. Mann wrote that everybody in the room agreed that the Briffa series was a potential distraction from the reasonably consensus viewpoint we'd like to present. Briffa recognized that there was pressure to present a nice, tidy story as regards apparent unprecedented warming in 1,000 years, but expressed many caveats, in particular that the proxies were not responding the way they were supposed to, and that the recent warmth was probably matched 1,000 years ago. Mann worried that skeptics would have a field day if the Briffa reconstruction were shown, as this might undermine, quote, faith in the paleo estimates. Mann was convinced that doubt was not scientifically justified and didn't want to give fodder to the skeptics. Matters settled down rather quickly, with Briffa apologizing to Mann for his temporary pangs of conscience. A couple of weeks later, Briffa sent Mann a revised reconstruction, one with more low-frequency variation, the one shown on left. The red part is what was later deleted. In the graphic at right, I show what it would have looked like had this been included, and the decline would have been quite visible. Mann sent in the first reviewer draft a few weeks later and had a very different appearance. It used what Jones later called Mike's nature trick. While climate scientists later described the trick as, quote, sophisticated, its main element was very coarse. Adverse data was simply deleted. A second element was a little more subtle. Any smooth series required forward values to calculate the smooth. It appears that Mann substituted instrumental data for actual data after 1960 to calculate the smooth, and then truncated the smooth in 1960. This used instrumental data to pull up the end value of the smooth Briffa series, further disguising the decline. The truncation was not reported by IPCC and is obviously not readily recognized in the tangle of spaghetti strands. The trick email came 2 weeks later and has been widely publicized. Jones did not entirely understand Mike's nature trick as used in the IPCC report. Rather than truncating the smooth Briffa series, as Mann had done, Jones spliced the instrumental record onto the proxy record, a method that Mann later condemned at Real Climate, not referring to this usage, Mann asserting that, quote, no researchers in this field have ever, to our knowledge, grafted the thermometer record onto any reconstruction, saying that this, quote, specious claim usually originated from industry-funded climate disinformation websites, like the WMO, I guess. The 99 WMO report was not widely cited or relied on. However, the third assessment report obviously was, and the hockey stick was more or less its logo, appearing no less than 7 times in different guises. It was even the backdrop for Houghton's press conference in Paris unveiling the report. After IPCC, the deletion of the decline became standard practice in spaghetti graphs. Here, BRIFA's 2001 articles are a bit schizophrenic, as he usually showed the decline in a standalone graphic, as in the one on the left, but then deleted it in the spaghetti version, shown at right. In this presentation shown here, BRIFA did not use man's nature trick, and the dangling end is more visible, but it still ends in 1960, and much of the decline is hidden. BRIFA and others made labored attempts to rationalize the situation. In 2002, BRIFA made the remarkable statement, seems remarkable to me, that, quote, in the absence of a substantiated explanation for the decline, we make the assumption that is likely to be a response to some kind of recent anthropogenic forcing. On the basis of this assumption, the pre-20th century part of the reconstruction is considered to be free of similar events and thus accurately represent past temperature variability. Mann's co-author Hughes drew an even more remarkable conclusion. He said that the divergence problem proved that the reconstructions were even more reliable than previously thought. I read Hughes' quote in April 2003, and it was partly responsible for my present involvement in climate science. At the time, my interest was quite casual. When I read the above statement, I could hardly believe that this sort of thing passed as science in modern society. So I emailed Mann for the underlying data in the Mann reconstruction, then the big dog in the IPCC world, only for Mann to tell me that he'd forgotten where the data was. This was the first step in what became a long road. Flash forward 2 years, May 2005, in the early days of Climate Audit, I read or reread the early BRIFA articles, the ones that didn't hide the decline, and idly wondered why there was no corresponding decline in the IPCC. I blew up their spaghetti graph and noticed the truncation of the BRIFA reconstruction, which is in green here, a truncation almost impossible to notice in the unzoomed version. I re-examined the IPCC text, verifying that it didn't disclose the truncation, and wrote it up at Climate Audit. Climate Audit had a much smaller audience then than now, and the post attracted only a few comments. In 2006, as many of you know, 2 blue ribbon panels looked at the controversy. Neither examined conduct issues. When Mann implausibly told the NAS panel that he didn't calculate the verification R2 statistic, as that would be a, quote, foolish and incorrect thing to do, the NAS panel sat there like bumps on a log. However, there were some interesting moments. Roseanne Dorigo astonished the NAS panel with a slide entitled Cherry Picking, in which she attempted to rebut criticism of biased proxy selection by saying, you have to pick cherries if you want to make cherry pie. She also presented a figure from her reconstruction which had a late 20th century discrepancy between proxies and temperature, though not as striking as in BRIFA. Panelist Kurt Cuffey asked her about it. Dorigo answered, oh, that's the divergence problem. Cuffey reasonably wanted to know how you could rely on proxies to register past warm periods if they weren't picking up modern warmth. Dorigo could only say that the matter was being studied. Richard Alley of Mann's soon-to-be employer Penn State was in attendance, saw the worried faces of the NAS panelists, and sent an urgent warning to key IPCC authors that the NAS panel might come down hard on the divergence problem. Overpeck had already heard about Dorigo's splash and hoped that BRIFA had good answers. and Briffa and Cook were urgently requested to write the NAS panel. Briffa's answer probably didn't reassure the panel very much. He acknowledged that the issue needed work, but pointed out that he was very busy with teaching and IPCC commitments and lacked fund for a research assistant to study the topic. He explained that as lead author of the relevant IPCC section, he decided not to, quote, overplay the issue because of its subtlety, and that the problem remained insufficiently studied to be of much concern. Cook acknowledged that it wasn't surprising that the panelists might come to doubt the value of the reconstructions, but called the doubt somewhat alarming. He conceded that doubt would be justified if the divergence were due to natural causes, but he argued that the divergence was due to some still unknown anthropogenic cause. He conceded that the lack of a known cause was unfortunate, but still thought this was insufficient grounds to question tree ring reconstructions. As in other parts of the report, the 2006 NAS panel made stronger statements in its text than in the overall spin. They conceded that the divergence problem reduced confidence in the correlation between rig widths and temperatures, but refrained from clearly stating the unavoidable corollary that called the tree ring reconstructions into question. For those of you who wonder about the thoroughness of these academic inquiries, NAS panel chairman Gerald North explained to a seminar at Texas A&M that they, quote, didn't do any research, that they got 12 people around the table and just kind of winged it, saying that's what you do in this kind of expert panel. Briffa definitely didn't overplay the divergence problem in the draft IPCC report. He didn't even mention it. Post-1960 values of his reconstruction were once again deleted. However, this time it did not pass unnoticed, as I was an IPCC reviewer and made a sharply worded comment that the decline be shown and explained as best they could. This and other review comments occasioned an important exchange in the summer of 2006. IPCC rules, which Overpeck had said were very strict in this regard, required reviewers to be registered and approved by IPCC. By June 2006, the comment period was over. Nonetheless, Briffa permitted Eugene Wall, a co-author of the team response to our articles and not even a registered reviewer, to insert changes to review comments and even to IPCC text that had been sent out to reviewers. The exchange was very surreptitious. Both Briffa and Wall emphasized the need for extreme secrecy. This correspondence was later the subject of the notorious delete all emails exchange. In May 2007, the fourth assessment report was published. Once again, the decline was not shown. However, after 10 years, they conceded in the running text that the divergence problem would limit the possibility of reconstructing past warmth, a disclaimer that hardly compensated for not showing the discrepancy in the spaghetti graph. In June 2007, after a climate audit campaign, IPCC placed the review comments and author responses online, reversing their previous policy of restricting access to physical inspection at Harvard Library. We then got to see how the authors had justified not showing the decline. Briffa had merely said it would be, quote, inappropriate. Nothing more, no explanation about why it would be inappropriate to show actual data. In late 2007, climate audit reader David Holland noticed that IPCC procedures assigned its review editors responsibility of ensuring that review comments were afforded appropriate consideration and that genuine controversies are reflected in the text. Holland wondered how Chapter 6 review editor Mitchell of the UK Met Office had discharged this obligation in respect to Briffa's refusal to show the decline and other unresponsive answers to review comments. Holland attempted to obtain Mitchell's comments first from IPCC, then from Mitchell, and ultimately through an FOI request to the UK Met Office. At first, Mitchell and the Met Office implausibly said that Mitchell's correspondence had been deleted. When asked to search backups, the Met Office changed its story, now making the equally implausible claim that Mitchell had attended IPCC meetings in a personal capacity and not in connection with his employment, and thus was not subject to FOI. When asked about expenses and salary, they changed their story once again, now claiming that production of the Mitchell emails would prejudice relationship between UK and the international community, the IPCC, and on its part, despite its supposed commitment to openness and transparency, the IPCC Secretariat refused to waive secrecy on Mitchell's comments. Holland also set a Freedom of Information request to CRU for any IPCC review correspondence that had been kept out of the official archive. Griffith's 2006 correspondence with Eugene Wall obviously fell in this category. 2 days after Holland's request, Jones asked Wall, Briffa, Mann, and Amon to delete any emails pertaining to the fourth assessment report. Jones also emailed Briffa and FOI Officer Palmer, saying that Briffa should tell Palmer that he, quote, didn't get any additional comments other than those supplied by IPCC, a claim that is obviously contradicted by the Wall correspondence. By 2009, these efforts had effectively stalemated. Then came Climategate. The trick email was spotted early on by Steve Mosher and was one of the first emails posted up on November 19th. Real Climate responded the next day saying that the emails merely showed people, quote, working constructively to improve joint publications, and that the trick was merely science speak for a good way to deal with the problem. And for the most part, climate scientists seem to have adopted Real Climate's viewpoint. The trick spread like wildfire into the media, even prompting its own video, Hide the Decline. Out of the early coverage, I thought Jon Stewart's take on The Daily Show was particularly acute. I think I've got a clip. Can you play this clip? I guess we're not going to get it. Stewart, after quoting about Mike's nature trick, pauses and says, "It means nothing. He's just using a trick to hide the decline. It's just scientists speak for using a standard statistical technique for calibrating data in order to trick you into not knowing about the decline." I urge you to see Stewart's original. To date, 4 inquiries have been set up. The first was to report was Penn State. Penn State, like Stewart's satire, said that the trick was, quote, nothing more than a statistical method used to bring 2 or more different data sets together in a legitimate fashion by a technique that had been reviewed by a broad array of peers in the field in order to trick you into not knowing about the decline. The deletion of adverse data is so obviously not a legitimate statistical method that it scarcely bears comment. Penn State did not interview any critics or targets, take any submissions, or provide any statistical references. Despite the mute testimony of the emails themselves, Penn State decided that there wasn't even prima facie evidence to proceed to an investigation on most issues, even ones where the UK Information Commissioner had said it was hard to imagine more cogent prima facie evidence. The UK parliamentary inquiry was next to report. They took submissions and had a brief hearing to which I wasn't invited. I made a submission that made specific reference to the trick, but my analysis wasn't considered. The hearing was covered by parliamentary reporters and not just science reporters. Many of the reporters were taken aback by Jones's testimony, expressing their discomfiture in stylish English prose. Quentin Letts of the Daily Mail, for example, described Vice Chancellor Acton as, quote, a younger version of Professor Calculus from the Tintin books, who beamed and nodded at everything Professor Jones said. I think that answer was spot on, he cried after listening to one response from the terror-stricken Jones. Dismayed by Jones's testimony, let's hope that the politicians sought second, third, and even 20th opinions. Other parliamentary correspondents were equally acidic. However, in a 3-to-1 decision, the parliamentary committee concluded once again that the trick was simply, quote, shorthand for the practice of discarding data known to be erroneous in order to trick you into not knowing about the decline. This finding was entirely, the finding that the data was known to be erroneous was entirely unsupported by the evidence. If tree rings had, for example, been measured incorrectly, then such data could have been discarded as erroneous. But that's not what happened. No one, not even the University of East Anglia, even hinted that the tree ring data had been measured incorrectly. The problem was different. The trees just didn't do what BRIFA anticipated. The committee's finding was totally unjustified. Now, in fairness, the parliamentary committee expressed its expectation that the science panel, the next inquiry, would weigh in on this matter, an expectation in which they were immediately disappointed. The science appraisal panel was led by Lord Oxford, the chairman of a large English wind utility. The panel was announced on March 22nd and reported on April 12th. Its report was only 5 pages long. They did not interview any critics or Climategate targets, nor did they take any submissions. Even its terms of reference remain unclear. The report stated that they were charged with assessing 11 essential papers that had been chosen on the advice of the Royal Society. However, the Royal Society has refused to answer any questions as to who at the Royal Society supposedly selected these 11 articles and why they were chosen. If they were trying to put questions to rest, the articles were singularly ill-chosen. The 3 BRIFA articles that were considered were the first 3 articles, all of which preceded the trick, and none of which were in dispute. None of CRU's proxy reconstructions were studied. In fact, it seems that the 11 articles were selected not by the Royal Society, but by the university. They proved to be the articles cited in the university's brief to the parliamentary committee, a submission in which the university was trying to put CRU in the best possible light by citing the articles in which the trick had not been used, not the ones where it had been used. Lame as their report is, they did contradict the claim that the trick was a good way of handling data. Instead, they said that the IPCC neglect to present the deleted data was regrettable. So it wasn't a good way of dealing with the data after all. Of course, the IPCC authors in question had not neglected to present the data. They had done so intentionally. And of course, the IPCC authors in question could hardly be separated from CRU and Climategate. They were BRIFA, Jones, and Mann. But the Oxford inquiry left all that out. Its own version of the trick, I guess. There is still one inquiry to go, the Muir-Russell inquiry, whose report is expected next month. It took submissions in a brief 2-week window in February, but like the others, hasn't talked to any CRU targets or critics. Incidentally, it isn't just the trick that the inquiries have failed to investigate. To an astonishing degree, they've totally avoided dealing with any issues that have been raised by critics. This was recently recognized by the 14 authors of the Hartwell paper, including Mike Hume of the University of East Anglia, which stated, quote, "Hitherto, none of the specific critiques of this work by those auditing it have been adjudicated by reviewers of the matter, and indeed were explicitly not investigated by the Oxford Review." The seeming obtuseness of these inquiries is obviously very frustrating, as there just doesn't seem to be accountability anywhere in the system. For the public, non-disclosure of adverse data, like the trick, seems like misconduct. But Pielke Jr., for example, has observed that there's little point trying to fit non-disclosure of adverse data into academic misconduct complaints because the practice is so widespread in the academic community, not just in climate science, that it is easy to provide supporting witnesses. And academics seem unoffended by the trick. But there's a price for not being offended, because the public expects more. If climate scientists are unoffended by the failure to disclose adverse data, unoffended by the trick, and not committed to principles of full, true, and plain disclosure, the public will inevitably react, as it has, by placing less reliance on pronouncements from the entire field, diminishing the coin of scientists who were never involved, as well as those who were. This is not a happy situation at a time when climate scientists are trying to influence policy, and has caused many of them to lash back, blaming everyone but themselves. And these tainted exonerations by these ineffective inquiries serve as an extra pretext for doing so. To the extent that the things like the trick were sharp practice, the practices need to be disavowed. The scientists do not need to be drummed out, but there needs to be some commitment to avoiding these sorts of sharp practice in the future. George Monbiot suggested early on that apologies were necessary on the part of climate scientists involved, both to the targets and to the wider community, something that, in my opinion, would go a long way to achieving some sort of truth and reconciliation in a difficult situation. However, right now, this seems less likely to happen than ever. Despite the failures of the inquiries to do their job, I strongly disagree with Cuccinelli's recent investigation of potential financial abuse. Regardless of what one may think of the quality of man's work, he's published diligently. In my opinion, Cuccinelli's actions are an abuse of administrative prerogative that on the one hand is unfair to man, and on the other hand provides an easy out for people to avoid dealing with real issues. I started my comments with caveats, and I'll close with some more. The critical scientific issue, as it has been for the past 30 years, is climate sensitivity and whether cloud and water cycle feedbacks are strongly positive or weakly negative or somewhere in between. This is a territory of Lindzen, Spencer, Kinnenmouth, and Paltridge at this conference, and I urge you to listen to what they have to say. But also keep an open mind, because many serious scientists do not agree with them and stand behind standard estimates of climate sensitivity to doubled CO2 in perfectly good faith. If the impact of doubled CO2 is relatively small, it would be through sheer good luck rather than good management. I don't subscribe to the view that we need perfect certainty to make decisions. On the contrary, businessmen and politicians make decisions all the time under unquantifiable uncertainty. And I, for one, unlike many of the sponsors here, have no philosophical objections to governments making decisions on climate policy. I also think that there may be important practical situations where people who are primarily worried about energy future can find common ground with people who are worried about climate. If I were a politician, regardless of what I felt personally, I would also take scientific guidance from official institutions rather than what I might think personally, either as an occasional contributor to academic journals or as a blogger. Although knowing what I know now, I would try as hard as I possibly could to improve the performance and accountability of these institutions. On the hockey stick, people sometimes say to me, if the hockey stick is wrong, then the situation is much worse than we think, arguing this on the basis that this would be evidence of greater climate sensitivity. My standard answer is, well, if that's the case, we should find out and govern ourselves accordingly and give no thanks to people whose obstruction has delayed the resolution of the problem. Thank you very much.